Judge Richard Carter sat at his bench, scanning the crowded courtroom with practiced indifference. The morning docket was filled with routine cases, parking tickets, speeding fines, and minor infractions. It was a typical Tuesday, the type of day Carter had grown accustomed to, where everything ran like clockwork and nothing ever felt out of the ordinary. The bailiff called the next case, and the name Vanessa Turner echoed through the courtroom. Carter looked up from his paperwork as the woman entered. She was tall, with a confident stride, dressed in professional, no-nonsense attire. There was an air of quiet intelligence about her, a certain calmness that made her stand out amidst the usual parade of defendants. Despite her composed appearance, Carter noticed a flicker of tension in her eyes, though she didn't let it show. Vanessa approached the bench with a polite nod, standing before him as Carter prepared to get to work. He could tell she was well-spoken. She didn't fumble with her words, didn't seem rattled by the formal setting. She was prepared, ready to face whatever was coming her way. It was a stark contrast to many of the defendants who often appeared nervous or evasive. Carter briefly scanned the details of her case: a traffic ticket for speeding in a school zone, a straightforward violation, no prior offenses. "Miss Turner," Carter began, his voice steady, "you're charged with exceeding the speed limit in a school zone. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Vanessa replied without hesitation, her voice clear and measured. Carter nodded, his expression unchanged. "Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Vanessa paused, then spoke, her tone calm yet firm. "I understand the seriousness of the offense, and I take full responsibility. I know the importance of traffic safety, especially near schools. I wasn't paying attention, and I sincerely regret the incident. I ask for a fair ruling, and I'll accept whatever decision you make." Her words hung in the air, a rare moment of genuine remorse in a courtroom where many defendants often try to make excuses or deflect responsibility. Carter regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He thought about her case objectively. After all, it was his job to remain impartial. She had admitted her guilt, had shown remorse, but the law was the law. Speeding was speeding. "Considering the circumstances," Carter began, his voice even, "I'm imposing a fine of $250. Please make sure you pay it within the next 30 days. Vanessa nodded, accepting the decision with quiet grace. She didn't argue, didn't try to plead her case further. She simply thanked him, turned, and walked out of the courtroom with the same calm demeanor she had entered with. As the sound of her footsteps faded, Carter glanced down at the file in front of him. Something about this case felt different, but he couldn't place why. The image of Vanessa's composed face lingered in his mind. Little did he know, that brief encounter would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about justice. Judge Carter sat at his desk, still mulling over the case from earlier that morning. It wasn't like him to second-guess a ruling, but something about Vanessa Turner's quiet dignity unsettled him. She had accepted her punishment without a fight, but there was an unspoken weight in her demeanor. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than just the routine traffic offense. He dismissed the thought, reminding himself that it was merely a case like any other, and he had made a fair judgment. Later that afternoon, Carter met with his mentor, Judge Samuel Harris, at the local law office where Harris had retired several years ago. The two had known each other for decades. Carter had clerked for Harris straight out of law school, and it was under Harris' guidance that Carter had climbed the ranks to the position he now held. Harris had taught him everything he knew about the law, but also about how to be a fair and thoughtful judge. The older man had a reputation for his deep understanding of both legal principles and human nature. Over coffee, they discussed a variety of topics: recent cases, law reforms, and Carter's upcoming decisions. As their conversation wound down, Harris casually mentioned that his daughter, Vanessa Turner, had recently moved back to town after living abroad for several years. Vanessa's been busy. She's been working with local nonprofits and getting involved in a few community initiatives, Harris said with pride. She's always been someone with a strong sense of responsibility, much like her mother. Carter's ear perked up at the mention of the name. Vanessa Turner. The name sounds familiar. Harris chuckled. Yes, well, she was in your courtroom this morning. I heard about the speeding ticket. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He tried to maintain his composure, but the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The woman he had found, the one whose calm presence had lingered in his mind all afternoon, was the daughter of his mentor. He tried to keep his voice steady, but he couldn't help but ask, "You mean Vanessa Turner is your daughter?" Harris nodded, smiling. "Yes, that's my girl. She's been living overseas for a while, but now she's back to make a difference here. I'm proud of her." Carter felt his stomach churn. He had just imposed a fine on the daughter of the man who had been instrumental in shaping his own career. The pieces clicked into place, and a wave of regret washed over him. How had he not made the connection sooner? He couldn't shake the thought that he might have treated Vanessa differently if he had known. His mind raced, wondering if his decision had been colored by the assumptions he had made about her in the moment. "She's a good woman," Harris continued, unaware of the conflict brewing in Carter's mind. "I think you'll get to know her more now that she's back. She's already making an impact." Carter nodded absently, but his thoughts were elsewhere. It was clear now that this was more than just a simple case. Judge Carter couldn't focus for the rest of the day. His mind kept returning to Vanessa Turner, the woman he had found just hours before. The realization that she was Judge Harris' daughter was something Carter couldn't easily shake. In his line of work, he'd always prided himself on maintaining objectivity, treating every case with the same impartiality, regardless of the person standing before him. But now, knowing Vanessa's connection to Harris, he wondered if that objectivity had failed him. Could he have been too quick with his ruling, too dismissive of the woman's situation? The thought troubled him, but he pushed it aside, convincing himself that the law was clear and there was no room for personal biases. Still, something about Vanessa's calm acceptance of the fine, her quiet strength, lingered in his thoughts. She hadn't pleaded her case or made excuses, yet Carter couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he hadn't fully considered the nuances of her situation. It wasn't until later that week that their paths crossed again, and this time, it was completely by chance. Carter was at a local charity event, an annual gathering organized by several legal professionals in the area to raise money for education programs. He was a regular attendee, but as he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on Vanessa. She was standing by the buffet table, engaged in conversation with a few people. Carter's heart raced a little as he noticed how easily she navigated the room. She was relaxed, her presence warm, yet commanding. He watched her for a moment before walking over, determined to at least acknowledge her after their earlier encounter in court. "Miss Turner," he said, offering a polite smile as he approached. "I didn't expect to see you here." Vanessa turned, her face breaking into a friendly yet reserved smile. "Judge Carter," she replied, her voice just as composed as it had been in court. "Nice to see you outside the courtroom." They exchanged pleasantries for a few moments, but it was clear that neither of them wanted to dwell on the formality of the situation. The conversation naturally shifted, and Vanessa mentioned something that caught Carter off guard. "My father mentioned you in passing the other day," she said casually, picking up a glass of water. "He spoke highly of your work." Carter, trying to hide the growing discomfort in his chest, nodded. "Judge Harris is a mentor to me," he said, though his words now felt strained. He wasn't sure if he should mention their earlier encounter in court. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like a mistake, an error in judgment that hadn't been warranted. He was about to say something when Vanessa's next words hit him like a thunderclap. "I never mentioned it before," she continued, almost as if she were reading his mind, "but I should thank you for the ruling. My father told me about the ticket. I didn't expect you to go easy on me, but I appreciate how professional you were." Carter froze. He wasn't sure how to respond. In that moment, he realized that Vanessa hadn't come to him with resentment, hadn't voiced any anger about the fine. Instead, she spoke with the same calm confidence he had noticed in court, But her words, though gracious, were not the ones he had expected to hear. Was that it? Was the fine something to simply be accepted, part of the rules of the game? Or had he missed something deeper, something more significant about her and the situation that he had failed to see? After the charity event, Judge Carter couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Vanessa's calm acknowledgement of the fine haunted him. It wasn't just her composed demeanor that unsettled him. It was the way she spoke, gracious, understanding, as though the fine was just another part of the system she had already accepted. He had expected her to be angry or frustrated, to argue or plead. But instead, she had treated the situation with a level of maturity and grace that made him wonder whether he had judged the situation too quickly. Back in his chambers the next day, Carter found himself replaying the events of the courtroom. He tried to be logical, to convince himself that his decision had been the right one. After all, the law was the law. But a growing sense of doubt gnawed at him, as if something in his process had been off. He'd always prided himself on being impartial, on applying the law without letting personal feelings cloud his judgment. Yet, Vanessa's calm response, and the fact that she was the daughter of Judge Harris, his mentor, made him question if he had been truly objective. He stared at the file on his desk, the same one that contained the details of Vanessa's case. Speeding in a school zone was a serious violation. It was black and white. There was no room for leniency in cases like these. And yet, as he ran his fingers across the papers, a thought began to form. Did the law always account for the full picture? What about the person standing in front of him? Was he so focused on the technicalities that he had missed something crucial about Vanessa's circumstances? Carter had spent years learning the intricacies of the law, following the rules to the letter. But something about the way Vanessa had carried herself made him wonder if there was a deeper lesson here, a lesson that had nothing to do with the facts of the case and everything to do with understanding the person before him. He reached for the phone and called his mentor, Judge Harris. As the line rang, Carter's mind raced. What could he even say? The last thing he wanted was to look weak or indecisive in front of someone who had helped shape his career. But he needed to talk to Harris, to make sense of his growing discomfort. When Harris picked up the phone, Carter didn't waste any time. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice tense. "About Vanessa. I think I made a mistake in court the other day." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Carter felt his heart beat faster as he waited for Harris's response. Was he overthinking it, or had he truly misjudged the situation? The phone call with Judge Harris didn't provide the clarity Carter had hoped for. After a long silence, Harris had only responded with a gentle chuckle, followed by, "Richard, you're a good judge. You don't need to second-guess yourself." But Carter couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't about the fine itself. It was about the deeper questions that were starting to form in his mind. He realized that his discomfort went beyond the specific case. It was about his entire approach to justice. Was he truly being fair, or had he been so focused on maintaining order and following the law that he had failed to see the person behind the case? Carter knew he couldn't keep pushing the thought aside. He needed to address it. So, the next day, he reached out to Vanessa. He called her office, offering a simple, "I'd like to meet, if you have some time." When she agreed, he suggested a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. Carter wasn't sure what he was hoping for. Maybe a chance to explain himself, or maybe just a conversation that might shed light on his own doubts. When they met, the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Vanessa was seated at a small table by the window, looking every bit as composed as she had in court. There was a warmth in her presence, but also an underlying strength. As Carter sat down across from her, he was struck again by how much she reminded him of her father, her calm demeanor, the sharpness of her mind, and that unshakable belief in fairness. "Thank you for meeting with me," Carter began, trying to steady his nerves. "I've been thinking about your case, and about the fine I imposed. Honestly, I feel like I missed something important." Vanessa didn't seem surprised by his words. She nodded thoughtfully, waiting for him to continue. I didn't realize you were Judge Harris' daughter when I ruled on your case, Carter admitted, his voice low. I don't know if that would have changed my decision, but I feel like I might have missed a broader context. You seemed so composed in court, so certain of yourself. I'm wondering if I might have treated you differently if I had known who you were. Vanessa's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. I understand why you might think that, she said quietly. But honestly, it's not about the fine. I accept that part of the system. What I want to talk about is the way we approach these cases, the way we view people. You see, I've had a lot of experiences in my life that have made me look at the law in a different way than most. Sometimes the law doesn't capture the full story. I think that's what's missing in many courtrooms. Carter felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had been so focused on applying the law fairly, so convinced that adhering to the letter of the law was enough. But Vanessa's words were starting to open a door to a much more complicated reality. The law, he now realized, was never just about facts and rules. It was about people, and perhaps he had overlooked that for far too long. I think you're right, he said, his voice quieter now. And I want to learn more about that perspective. Vanessa smiled faintly, and for the first time, Carter felt like he was truly listening, not just as a judge, but as a human being trying to understand something bigger than himself. The weeks following his conversation with Vanessa marked a turning point for Judge Carter. The seeds of doubt planted in him during their cafe meeting grew into a deep desire to re-examine his approach to justice. Vanessa had spoken to him about seeing people behind their cases, about the need to acknowledge the complexities of their lives beyond the legal framework. Those words resonated with him, but they also left him unsettled. What did it truly mean to be fair? Was the law enough, or was there more he needed to understand? Carter spent late nights poring over past cases, trying to identify where he might have overlooked the nuances of the individuals before him. He reread transcripts of trials and rulings he'd made over the years, asking himself a simple yet difficult question. Asterisk, did I see the full picture? Asterisk. He recalled cases where he had ruled with an almost mechanical precision, assuming that the law alone could account for the complexities of human behavior. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that he had, in many instances, applied the law without considering the real-life consequences on those who stood before him. Vanessa had opened his eyes to a perspective he had never fully embraced before, a perspective that blended the law with empathy and understanding. He found himself reflecting on his conversations with Judge Harris. Over the years, Harris had often spoken about the importance of seeing beyond the surface, but it was easy to dismiss those lessons in the heat of the courtroom, where efficiency and order often took precedence over deeper reflection. Harris had always been the voice of reason, the mentor who pushed Carter to consider the broader context, but Carter had often adhered too strictly to the rules, assuming they alone would ensure fairness. It was during a particularly sleepless night that Carter decided to confront his mentor directly. He picked up the phone and dialed Harris's number. "Sam," Carter began once Harris picked up, "I've been thinking a lot about what we've talked about over the years, about fairness, about understanding the full picture. I think I've been too focused on the black and white of the law, and not enough on the shades of gray that come with each case." There was a pause on the other end. Then Harris replied, his voice warm but firm, "You're not the first judge to go through this, Richard. It's easy to get caught in the routine of rulings, to fall back on the idea that as long as you're following the law, you're doing the right thing. But justice isn't just about following rules. It's about recognizing the humanity in every case." Carter's heart sank a little at the realization. Harris had always known this, had always understood that justice required more than a rigid application of rules. Carter had only been starting to learn it. "Sam," he said, "I need to make changes. I want to be a judge who sees people, not just cases, but I don't know where to start." There was a brief silence before Harris's voice softened. "Start by remembering what we've always talked about. Listen, really listen, Richard. The law doesn't tell you everything. It's the stories behind the laws that matter." As the conversation ended, Carter felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't an easy path ahead, but he now understood that the journey wasn't about merely applying the law. It was about understanding the people who walked into his courtroom and recognizing the stories they carried with them. Judge Carter returned to the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. The late-night reflections, the conversations with Vanessa and Judge Harris, and his own growing realization that justice required more than just applying the law had fundamentally changed his approach. He no longer saw his role as simply a figure of authority, handing down verdicts with efficiency and precision. Instead, he viewed it as an opportunity to truly understand the people who came before him, to see them as individuals with unique circumstances, struggles, and stories. It wasn't an easy shift to make. Carter had spent his entire career adhering to the strictest principles of legal procedure, often focusing on the facts and ignoring the context. But as he sat at the bench that morning, he felt a subtle shift in his mindset. He looked at the cases in front of him not as simple legal matters, but as human experiences in need of understanding. The first case that day was a young man named Alex, charged with theft after being caught shoplifting at a local store. Normally, Carter would have handed down a fine or brief sentence, based purely on the facts: the stolen items, the store's loss, and the young man's lack of prior offenses. But today, as he listened to Alex's story, something in Carter's approach changed. Alex was no hardened criminal. He wasn't a repeat offender. Instead, he was a young man from a struggling family, trying to survive in a system that seemed stacked against him. He explained that he had stolen food to feed his younger sister, who was ill and had been unable to attend school. His mother worked long hours at a low-paying job, and Alex had recently lost his part-time position. His desperation had led him to make a poor choice, but it wasn't an act born out of malice or a desire to break the law. Carter felt the familiar sense of duty to uphold the law, but he also felt the weight of Alex's story. This wasn't just a theft. It was a cry for help. The law had a role to play, but so did compassion. "Alex," Carter said, his voice firm but empathetic, "I understand the circumstances that led to this, and I'm not blind to the challenges you're facing. However, you still broke the law. I have to hold you accountable for that. But instead of a traditional fine or jail time, I want you to take part in a community service program. You will help local charities that assist families in need. I believe this is a chance for you to give back and find support for your own family." Alex looked up, surprised but grateful. He nodded, understanding that he had been given a chance, a second chance, one that didn't come from the law alone, but from a system that now recognized his humanity. As Alex left the courtroom with a lighter step, Carter felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had made a decision that was more than just lawful, it was just. And for the first time in a long time, Carter felt that he had truly seen the person behind the case. But this was only the beginning. Carter knew that he had a long way to go. There would be more cases, more stories, and more difficult choices, but for the first time in his career, he felt equipped to navigate them, not with rigid adherence to the law, but with a deeper understanding of the human beings who came before him. Weeks passed, and Judge Carter's approach to justice continued to evolve. His rulings were still grounded in the law, but now they carried an added layer of empathy and understanding. He listened more intently, questioned more deeply, and most importantly, recognized that every case was more than just a set of facts. It was a person's story. The more he embraced this perspective, the more Carter realized how much he had underestimated the complexities of human lives. One morning, as Carter was preparing for another full day of hearings, he received an unexpected visit from Vanessa Turner. She entered his chambers with a warm yet serious expression. She had heard about the changes in his courtroom, the decisions he had made, and the way he had been handling cases differently. "Judge Carter," she began, her voice filled with quiet respect, "I wanted to thank you personally. I've been hearing things from the community about how you've been handling cases lately. It's not just the rulings. It's the way you're listening, the way you're seeing people for who they are. It's a shift, and I think it's making a difference. Carter paused, surprised by her words. Vanessa had been a catalyst for his change, but hearing this praise made him realize how far he had come. "Thank you, Vanessa," he said, his voice sincere. "I've been working hard to do better. You opened my eyes to something I wasn't seeing before." Vanessa smiled, though there was a thoughtful look in her eyes. "It's not just about 1 or 2 cases, Judge. You've inspired others to rethink how they approach the law, too. The system can be rigid, yes, but you're showing that it can be flexible, compassionate. You're not just making decisions. You're making a difference." The weight of her words settled on him. Carter had always seen himself as a figure of authority, but now he was beginning to see himself as someone who could influence change, someone who could be a force for good beyond the confines of his courtroom. Vanessa continued, her tone gentle but firm. "I think you've started to understand something important. Justice is about balance. The law must be upheld, but so must the humanity behind the law. There's room for both." Carter nodded slowly. He knew now that his work was far from done. Every day, every case was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to evolve as a judge and as a person. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he also knew he was on the right path. As Vanessa left his chambers, Carter looked out the window, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had started as a judge determined to follow the letter of the law, but now he understood that true justice required seeing beyond the law itself. It required understanding, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. In the days that followed, Carter continued to make decisions with this newfound perspective. The courtroom was still a place of rules, but it had become something more, an arena for growth, understanding, and the pursuit of true justice. Carter knew that, with every decision he made, he was shaping not just the lives of those in front of him, but also the future of the justice system itself. And as he sat on the bench day after day, he realized that the most important lesson he had learned was this: justice was not a set of rules to be followed. It was the story of people to be understood.